Hello, and welcome to today's Situation Report. We're talking about what's happened in Ukraine, both along the front and behind it. And it's certainly worth highlighting the use of drones far behind the front lines by both sides, which has been reported. On the Ukrainian side, attack helicopters have been lost, and the Ukrainians have released a video in which they destroy 15 Russian aircraft. We want to take a look at all of this here. And at the same time, of course, we want to talk about what's happening along the front, where movement is still limited, but things are slowly starting to shift. There are also interesting indications regarding Russian developments in troop generation. The Russians are trying to generate soldiers in a new way there. This gives us an indication of how recruitment is currently taking place within Russia. We want to take a look at that as well, and also talk about international support, and so on and so forth, as always. Afterwards, as usual, there will be a Q&A session, and about 30 to 40 minutes after the end of this stream, I will be active on Twitch. Probably just a bit of War Thunder, but we'll see about that, and that's it for now. I would say, let's get started right away. Holy smokes! Now save the most at Holy with my code. The Russians want. The Ukrainians have once again attacked targets in Russia. They managed to hit a power plant in Belgorod. Here we have the report from Telegraph Agency of the Soviet Union. According to the reports, high-mobility artillery rocket systems were used in the attack. Russia, for its part, attacked Ukraine, and yesterday hit a train traveling to Kharkiv, 47 kilometers from the front, with several Shahed drones. At least 5 civilians were killed, and several hundred people were on board the train. The Ukrainians, for their part, also hit an oil refinery in Krasnodar. Here we can clearly see the different targets each side is attacking. Let's move on to the developments along the front, and we'll start in the Sumy region, up here. I have no new reports or updates from there. The same goes for Vovchansk and Vilnius, the Lika-Burluk region. The first reports we have are from Kupiansk, and there was a Russian infiltration relatively far towards Kutkivka, where Russian troops were spotted and engaged. Kutkivka is, as we can see, roughly about 3.5 kilometers west of the previous Russian position. That's north of Kupiansk, where the Ukrainians still hold the initiative. But that doesn't mean the Russians are inactive in this region. A Russian mill blogger writes about the situation in Kupiansk, mentioning the soldiers. He's reporting about some here. They have been cut off for 3 months, which shows us what the situation is like here. He also describes that they have to count every single bullet, and of course, fight for their lives. I mean, in the end, that's a Russian mill blogger who writes for a specific audience. But he confirms here that in some cases, Russian soldiers have been cut off on the ground for months. The Ukrainians have also been spotted at Piszczane, directly to the northeast and north of it. And that's remarkable because Piszczane is here, and Ukrainian soldiers have been spotted in positions roughly here and here, which in itself should mean that they have control over this area here. So Ukrainian control at Piszczane goes a bit further than what the Ukrainian deep state map implies here. South, near Borowa, the Russians have advanced in Saporische. We have geolocated this at this position here, so it's roughly here. In this area, the Russians have advanced a little bit, at least from what we can see. Towards Lyman, a Russian soldier was spotted at the edge of Lyman, right here in the south. This is the village of Lyman, and we have geolocated it here at this spot, at the outermost houses. These remain infiltrations here too, but of course, this shows us that the Ukrainians no longer control the area with the same level of security as is still implied here. Towards Sloviansk, we have numerous small Russian advances, mainly infiltrations, where we cannot yet be sure how far the Russians are consolidating their positions. In general, the Russian offensive in this direction roughly remains in place and is being maintained. We have Russian geolocation at various points everywhere. Geolocation of Russian soldiers. mostly in contested areas. But we can see that the Russians have developed a certain momentum here recently, even if it is relatively slow. South of that, we have two remarkable changes. And Russians have been geolocated here on their way to Nikiforivka. We have that right here at this spot. We can see it on the southern edge of Nikiforivka here. And that, in turn, implies that the Russians have probably taken Komivka and Bondarny by now. The two villages to the south are likely now under Russian control. To the west of that, the Russians have advanced toward Pravila. Here, too, there are new territorial gains to the west, which we have geolocated. Here, and we have the pro-Ukrainian deep state map, which attributes part of the control of Minkivka to the Russians. I haven't seen any geolocation regarding this yet, but if the pro-Ukrainian side says we've lost ground at that spot, then, we assume that's correct. South of that, towards Kostiantynivka, we have the Russians southeast of Berostok, in an area where, until now, little Russian presence had been confirmed. We have that here. That's somewhere in this region, I think. We can take another quick look. Kostiantynivka, we have this forested area here, right here, roughly here, so there is further Russian offensive pressure towards Kostiantynivka here. In general, the contested area in this region is obviously particularly large. We keep getting geolocations from both sides, sometimes implying that they're operating behind the other side's front lines. However, the whole area here continues to put pressure on the Ukrainian positions, which can have a significant delaying effect and greatly slow down the Russians' advance. West of there, near Dombropilya, the Russians have reached Novy Donbass's southern edge. That is likely also an infiltration, which does not imply any kind of control. The Russians advance with small groups, and they keep managing to break through. That doesn't mean the Russians have established themselves there, but this is the first geolocation from Novy Donbass. In this regard, the Russians are useful because they show us a tendency, the direction in which things are moving. There we see that after effectively taking Myrnograd and Pokrovsk, the Russians, even though probably not every single square meter of both settlements is under Russian control yet, that their movement towards the northwest continues and is slowly advancing, that's it. From the region, I don't have any changes myself from Pokrovsk and Myrnograd. The first changes I can document again are from the direction of Saporische. There, the Russians have advanced far to the north with infiltrations, or at least relatively far. We have them here in the village of Pavlivka, and directly north of it is Novojavkovlivka. That's probably how it should be called. Here and also here, there is geolocation from today, which means there are now Russian positions here and here. Again, this doesn't always mean geolocation, not consolidation, but it does mean that Russian soldiers have now appeared there for the first time. And you can see that about 9 kilometers north of Malish-Cherbaki, where the Russians last operated, and also a bit further east of Stepnohursk. Here, too, we see that the Russians have noticeably advanced in this direction, at least temporarily. The situation remains mostly the same. The Russians hold the initiative nearly everywhere except near Kobiansk. In the meantime, they have regained the initiative at Vovchansk and Sumy. They are advancing in many places, by no means everywhere, but in many places they are advancing, but they're at the usual pace. Although subjectively, it seems to me that things have sped up a bit since the last situation report, and that would meet expectations, because in the last situation report, we saw that the weather in Ukraine is improving. The temperatures are rising, and in this way, it might be easier for the Russians to advance. Overall, the situation is mostly unchanged, but we have some interesting new information. This is a video that surfaced today, and it shows a Ukrainian search 25, which had obviously mounted a camera on its wing. And according to reports, it is hit by an R-37M. We already talked about this 3 years ago, I think I made a video here about this missile and the Russian use of it. This is a very long-range missile that the Russians use from their fighter jets, out of range of Ukrainian missiles and out of range of Ukrainian air defenses. And in this way, they attack Ukrainian pilots and Ukrainian fighter jets along the front. And according to Ukrainian soldiers, they are fired at multiple times with such missiles during almost every mission. While this missile itself apparently has some difficulty hitting a fast, quickly maneuvering target, it is actually more suitable for large targets. That doesn't mean they're unsuccessful because of that. And here we can see such a tragic success for the Ukrainians. We can see the aircraft here. And if you look at it, you can see how a detonation occurs. And here you can see the detonation and how the aircraft breaks apart, falls into pieces, and then goes down to the ground. In this case, the pilot also lost his life. He was killed in the process. At least, that's what the reports I found say. And that, once again, shows the difficulty Ukrainian soldiers are facing. But there is also good news for Ukraine. The Ukrainians report that they are succeeding in expanding the kill zone along large parts of the front. This is a very important thing the Ukrainians need to achieve. In the last situation report, we talked about how the Ukrainians said they were especially successful at Kupiansk, where they can eliminate Russian forces far ahead of the front line. This is necessary to a greater extent along the front, and according to their own statements, they are becoming increasingly successful at it. Then we have news about recruitment, as we can see here. Kommersant reports that the Russian Ministry of Defense is looking for pilots for combat drones, and that's quite interesting, because they are supposed to be recruited for a limited period, 1 year specifically for the unmanned drone forces. And the point is that they are limited to this function. That's how it's being advertised. And they are supposed to serve for only 1 year. They would have the opportunity to leave the military after the year if they don't voluntarily sign a new contract. It's ruled out they'll be transferred to other units. Simply put, they want to say, you won't be sent to the infantry or combat missions unless you choose to. And that's a story that keeps coming up on the Russian side, where people say they signed up for this or that. And there's the case of an American. He emigrated to Russia and volunteered for the Russian armed forces to get the passport faster. And he was told that because he could weld, he would be assigned to the rear area. And the latest reports were that he was transferred to the infantry, to the assault troops. There are no reports yet on how many combat missions he has already had, or whether he has been killed in action. Recently, his wife posted videos proving he was alive. So that still works? But of course, these reports are being spread around so that people volunteer for a certain role. And that's actually a constant topic when you look at Russian comments. Russian veterans reports, and reports from Russian recruits. They're actually never told that they'll be assigned to the assault units. Instead, they're always promised that they'll be doing this or that in the future, in the rear, only to find themselves at the front again and being sent into attacks. Since, of course, this eventually reaches the Russians as well, we see that this is how they try to recruit personnel, by promising them that things will be different. We also see here that they especially want people with qualified skills. As representatives of the Ministry of Defense explained to Kommersant, strong analytical skills, computer knowledge, and fine motor skills are required. That means it's not about finding a few drug addicts and alcoholics here, but rather you need healthy, probably younger people with good reflexes and so on. And these people obviously do not want to join the military in sufficient numbers because they fear becoming cannon fodder there. This once again confirms what we've discussed several times on the channel. Also with Russian sources, while the Russian side is calling for recruitment, when it comes to the quality of the soldiers, we're talking about a completely different level. And while that may seem promising for the Russians, it's not the case that the opposition media Astra just spoke with a lawyer, and he says they sign a completely normal contract with the Russian armed forces. and accordingly, they can of course be transferred to other units. And as long as they are in the area of the special mission, that is, the special military operation, of course their contract can also be extended without their consent. That means, even with that, it is probably, again, it may be that the Russians are once again deceiving the recruits. But at least here we can see how the Russian side wants to deal with it. Because especially those who are healthy, who are young, who have the skills that are being mentioned here. These are not people who are currently enlisting in large numbers in the military if they expect to be sent into assault attacks after only a short training period. These people are needed for specific skills, as I mentioned. I've already made a video about this, or actually several videos by now, where I also explain things like the quality of a soldier, their health condition, and so on, are also important. The Russians have been making big compromises there for a while, not least because they expect their soldiers not to survive long at the front, and therefore they feel able to make compromises there. Then we have here from Serhiy Flesh, who, by the way, is now advising the Minister of Defense in Ukraine, who points out here that the Russians are starting to use Starlink on attack drones, and apparently this was used in recent attacks that were published here by the Russians. Here we see an attack on a Mi-24 and then a Mi-8, so a combat helicopter and then a military transport helicopter, which can also be used for ground attacks. And obviously, the attacks were able to be carried out here. There was geolocation, according to which this is 250 kilometers from the front. So these attacks are taking place far in the rear area, and we can see here that there is already a fire, which suggests that the attack happened at the same airfield and that the Mi-8 was also hit here. Of course, that's very bad news for the Ukrainians if they have to feel threatened in the rear area in this way as well. That's probably why the security service of Ukraine released this video here, where we first have the explanation of what was supposedly destroyed. 11 fighter jets and bombers from Sukhoi, 30, 34, 27, and 24, as well as Mikoyan Gurevich, 31 helicopters and transport planes. And they say, I've watched it twice now, it looks like this. No, I changed the language, that's what we wanted. When we watch the video, we see that some parts are clearly old footage. We can see summer or autumn weather here, and there we can see all kinds of attacks on fighter jets. The Ukrainians mention 5 airfields attacked with this. Here's a Sukhoi 24 and a Sukhoi 34. According to Ukrainian sources, the attacks took place last year, but these are definitely not all the attacks they carried out last year. So it's a bit surprising and not entirely clear to what extent these were actually new attacks or not. But here, they're demonstrating what Russian combat aircraft they were able to attack and destroy in the rear area. And as you can see, that adds up to a considerable amount. The Ukrainians say that they destroyed combat aircraft worth $1 billion in the process. Then we have news on the political front, the Russian ones. Here, an opposition media outlet, Meduza, reports that prices are rising in Russia. Russia increased the value-added tax in January or December, and unsurprisingly, this is causing food prices to rise. That shouldn't really come as a surprise now, so, once again, this shows that war financing simply can't happen without the population noticing it directly. Then Zelensky says the document with the United States security guarantees is 100% finished, meaning it's ready to be signed. It would then go to Congress and the Rada to be ratified. This is significant because it obviously tells us that this is not an interstate treaty, like the one the German government, for example, has signed with Ukraine. I already said back then that those aren't very valuable, because a federal chancellor naturally has a certain authority, and he also has a certain authority to sign something. But the commitments that Germany has made with such security agreements that were concluded with Ukraine are, of course, on a completely different level, and also on a completely different binding level, as if, for example, it were an actual decision and a ratification by the parliament. And the fact that it is being said here that it would go to the parliaments speaks for a significantly better legal safeguard. However, what's important is, of course, what's actually written in it. He also says here that Europeans would provide additional security guarantees. And here we have the Financial Times, which reports that the United States will probably demand the surrender of Donbass for this, as it says. Washington has also indicated that it would promise Ukraine more weapons to strengthen its peacekeeping army, if it agreed, as the price for peace with Russia, to withdraw its troops from the areas of the eastern region it controls, said two of the people the Financial Times spoke to. If we look at what we currently know, I want to give my assessment of it. I believe that this is the most realistic scenario and the one we can expect, that it would be something like the Taiwan Relations Act, meaning an agreement in which the United States would legally commit to providing Ukraine with all the means it needs to defend itself. As with Taiwan, everything would be paid for. Ukraine could then buy United States weapons, like Taiwan, to defend against Russia. But just like with Taiwan, it would also be possible for the United States to refuse to deliver certain weapons, even if requested. For example, with Taiwan and the F-35S, Taiwan has no chance of getting them. That helps, especially since Ukraine hasn't been able to buy whatever it wanted since the situation escalated in 2014. We remember that under Obama, sleeping bags were delivered. As Poroshenko said back then, sleeping bags are good and important, but we can't shoot at Russians with them. It was then Trump who sent the javelins. And of course, since the escalation of the war in 2022, a lot more has come. If Ukraine can simply order directly in the United States in this way, and the United States has made a legal commitment to this, then of course that's a significant improvement. However, it's a major financial challenge Ukraine likely can't handle alone at the required scale. But this is just my view. I think that's the only realistic thing we can expect from the United States. NATO membership, which would truly secure Ukraine, is not an option. I've stated this here many times before, not least because the borders between both sides are still disputed, and because Ukraine has foreign troops on its internationally recognized territory with whom it is in conflict. It's unthinkable that under such circumstances, NATO membership would be realistic. The other alternative to that, and what is often mentioned, is an agreement that would be equivalent to NATO's Article 5 with the United States, that would be a bilateral alliance agreement, like the ones the United States has with the Philippines or with Japan, for example. But that's hopeless. It's simply not realistic that this will happen. Neither Trump nor Congress would agree to it. So the consequence would be that the United States would legally commit itself to assisting Ukraine in a war against Russia. A security guarantee would also have to mean that the American side promises to help if the situation arises. And then, of course, we have to consider that. It's also completely unacceptable for Russia. That means, as long as Russia is not forced into such an agreement, and we are currently far from that, this is not a solution. The most realistic option is likely a Ukraine Relations Act, which the Kremlin would probably oppose since it would hinder future invasions. And the Kremlin wants the Ukrainian armed forces to be as small and as powerless as possible after this war, in order to make it easier in the event of another invasion. But if we examine the security guarantees in question, we've seen major changes. Now, moving away from NATO membership through Article 5, there are repeated statements that supplying weapons to a strong Ukrainian army is the best security guarantee. And if we look at this in the context of what's realistic, because we must not forget that negotiations are currently taking place. And right now, the situation is that Donald Trump is the United States president, and that his party has the majority in Congress and the Senate. And in this context, anything about a Ukrainian Relations Act is simply quite unrealistic. Therefore, that would be the expectation I would have for a potential solution to this war. Then we also have international support. There, the Minister of Defense reports that more Mirage 2000S are expected, and that discussions are taking place with the French about this. That's nothing generally new either. The Mirage 2000 is being phased out by the French, and, whenever any become available, they are handed over to the Ukrainians. So, Ukraine can expect more Mirage 2000S in the foreseeable future. And that's it for the situation report at this point.